Hello, I'm Robert Smith, the Microsoft Alliances Director at Content and Cloud, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Cloud Revolution. Today we're going to help you understand how you can use the power of Azure to modernise and accelerate and transform your business. You'll hear from our experts, Microsoft and customers on exactly how and when to make the move to the cloud, the technologies and processes that you need to consider when making that move, and also some tips, tricks and helpful information on how to make your cloud transformation successful. We are all in the middle of the fourth industrial revolution, and just as steam power, electricity, the internal combustion engine and the microprocessor revolutionised and changed the way we live our lives and do business, so now the cloud, AI and digitally interconnected services continue to drive and accelerate that pace of change. And making that move to the cloud can be daunting. Not only do you need to understand the technological impact, but also the further impact on your people and business processes in order to make the move to the cloud successful. Today, we're going to help you understand how that move can work for you and how to make the best of those digitally interconnected services to drive real transformational change for you and your organisation. Maybe you're looking to understand how Azure can benefit you and your business. Or maybe you already understand a little bit about what Azure can do, but are not quite sure how to take that best first step. Or maybe you've already made the move to the cloud and are now looking to embrace the innovation that Azure can bring to continue to transform your organisation. Today, we're going to answer each of those questions and leave you with further information on how to make that move to the cloud or to modernise and embrace the innovation capabilities that it brings wherever you are on your current Azure transformational journey. Welcome to your cloud revolution. Hello again. I'm joined this morning by two of my colleagues, Nick Ishwood and Paul Collins, and we're here today to talk about planning migration to Azure and customers that are maybe looking at taking that first step into the cloud. Now, obviously, this is quite a large and broad subject, so I've picked out a few points that I think that might be of interest to most people. And a lot of the organisations that will be watching this today might have tried Azure, or they might have dabbled a little bit, but have never done anything sort of serious in terms of a large cloud migration. But maybe something's happened that's changed their thinking. Maybe their data centre is starting to creak, or they've got a compelling event in terms of a contract renewal or some sort of commercial event that's going to happen. And I guess top of mind for a lot of people well, where do they start? What's the first thing they need to think about? How do they start to plan this cloud migration?
So a great place to start is the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework. So it's a document with a set of guidance published by Microsoft that helps you move to the cloud. It helps you understand how you're going to get the best out of a cloud. That goes right from the very start. So thinking about what you're going to do, what your strategy is, what your motivations are for going to the cloud, right through to cost management and getting the best out of it. It's a long document. It's well worth reading those. So if you have started your journey already, you can jump in. There's some tools that let you assess where you are on that journey. But what we really see a lot of customers do is not really understand the whys properly. So why are they going to the cloud? And making sure that's communicated to everybody in the project and across the business, because that's your measure of success, right? If you don't know why you're doing it in the first instance, then there's a good chance when you get to the end of it and not necessarily see the project as a success. If you're running things already, then take a good look at your infrastructure you've built around your first application. Make sure you've got a solid landing zone there that's able to accommodate the influx of new workloads into the cloud. So really by the landing zone, we're talking about the plumbing. You want to make sure you've got your guardrails and things in place that ensure when you drop something into Azure that you're doing so in a well-managed, secure and governed way. But yeah, really can't overrate the importance of the CAF and the planning.
Okay,
that's the outset.
Yeah. So that's really interesting. And I guess once you've sorted that why and then understand sort of where you are, I guess there's different approaches that customers can take. Can you elaborate on what some of those might be?
Yeah, exactly. And it's really picking up on the point Paul was making around motivations, just understanding why we're doing this, because that helps sort of shape what type of migration we're going to do. And to give you some examples, really, we have clients that we work with that come to us, they're under certain time pressures to achieve things, with a finite deadline. You mentioned before it might be as simple as a data center contract expiry. Some clients might be under pressure to achieve things like Cyber Essentials Plus, so they need to move into Azure quickly, as they are, to get past some of these urgent priorities. So really that defines, if you like, what we call a lift optimized shift type migration, where we're not really moving away from the type of infrastructure-based approach. We're doing some optimizations along the way in terms of performance and cost, but we're not fundamentally changing the infrastructure design. We're actually getting them out of the data center as quickly as possible. And then on the flip side of that, we obviously have a much more detailed migration where customers are talking to us about really truly doing their transformation piece and looking at things from an application perspective and saying, well, do we really need to take this application into the cloud? Could we move this to a SaaS application? Could we rebuild it in Power Platform, this business process? There may be some residual infrastructure, but there's certainly more of an appetite in that case to go to platform as a service or serverless within Azure, which has some other benefits we'll pick up in a little while. So I would say that it's really important to start to understand the time pressures, the priorities for the clients that align with their strategy, so we can then define what type of migration we're really looking at, certainly in that first phase anyway.
So once they've determined sort of the outcomes and that they're trying to drive and the why, and they've understood the strategy and sort of what their approach is going to be, what's their next step? What's that sort of first step that they need to take? And are there any sort of common pitfalls or forks in the road that can be avoided to make sure that it's as successful as it can be?
Okay, so again, sort of following that CAF guidance really, once you've got your strategy defined, you've got your business case written, your team's assembled, so you've got the right skills. So again, something, before you even start, my first pitfall is it's not to have skilled people. Yeah, so if you haven't got the skills there at that point within your organisation, then you can look to see whether it's appropriate to partner. And there's some good reasons to do so. There's guidance there from Microsoft. The things in place, you can do this yourself, right? It can be done. You don't have to get a partner involved. But a partner's always going to help you, both in terms of expertise. So it's a good chance if it's your first cloud migration, you've never done it before, right? So you don't know what to expect. A partner is going to have been through it many, many times, so they're going to know those pitfalls and things to watch out for. And also they can help you leverage things that are in play from Microsoft, right? So Microsoft have some great programs in the marketplace. They change frequently, but they're there to help guide you on that journey, and a partner can help leverage Microsoft and make sure that they're there to back you as well. So not only have you got the partners' engagement, but you've got Microsoft's focus as well. Once you've done that, decided you might be with a partner, you might be going alone. Next thing is a landing zone, really. I touched on that in the previous answer, but really it's making sure you've got that strong foundation, because without that, you might move your first couple of workloads successfully, but on your 99th, your 100th, are you still trucking along with all those important things like security, cost management, policy? All those things need to be in place and get that landing zone robust. And then really you can start tackling your migration, maybe in waves of maybe 10 at a time, maybe more, depending on the size of your environment and how much you can handle.
Yeah, I would just add on to that point by saying that as well, if we think about, as Paul said, building the landing zone, we can also be running some discovery at that point as well, maybe on the existing estate. And Microsoft provides some great tools that are free for us to access to be able to help with that discovery process. So examples might be to effectively run a scan of the existing estate to look at the infrastructure and how it's being utilised. That helps us with some of the right sizing decisions that we take as we go into Azure. And also there's other tool sets that can help us assess things like databases. Where we're going to modernised databases from infrastructure into platform as a service, we'd need to run some assessment on the databases to understand the compatibility and the deployment options available to us as well. So I would definitely recommend taking a look at Azure Migrate, which is a hub for some of these tools that we can access free. And there's some third-party tools as well that play into Azure Migrate. All of these are available, if you like, through the Azure Marketplace. And it's a great place to start to understand what we've got today, how it's being used, and what that might look like in an Azure environment, and obviously the cost associated with it.
Yeah, and again, depending on the your motives for migration as well, you might run that discovery across your entire estate.
Yeah.
You might look into individual workloads in more depth, especially if you're going down that modernisation path, right? So you might really hone in on some specific workloads where you need more more information. And again, that's where some of the third-party tools come in, right?
Yeah, precisely. I mean, organisations that are just wanting to move because they've got some burning priority, it's great to still be able to do discovery anyway so we can do the right sizing. But if an organisation comes to us and they want to build a data analytics platform, then there's much more likelihood to be more transformation needed on the existing estate than there would be with just a simple lift and shift. So I think the discovery plays into most types of organisations to some degree.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
So with all that in mind, we've got to the stage where we understand sort of why we're doing it. We've understood what our approach is. We've figured out what the first step is, and maybe we've addressed some of that question around skilling and training and all of that sort of piece. How long does this take? I mean, I appreciate that there might be a bit of a range in there, but if you've lined everything up, if you've got all of those ducks in a row already, what's sort of the typical time frame for an organisation moving from on-premise into the cloud?
I'll take that one. So, as you said, there's a broad brush. So, it depends again on complexity of the workload you're moving, whether you're going down that lift and shift approach, or whether you're looking to transform, re-architect applications. Obviously takes a lot longer. Typical lift and shift, I mean, we see most people start there, to be truthful. Bit of optimization, as Nick said, to make sure you're not burning money unnecessarily. And when we see people, do waves of anywhere between 20 and 50 servers in a batch, and they can do that over the course of a week, typically. It depends, again, appetite for risk and the ability to I guess for the operations teams as well. So something we haven't touched on, but once you move these servers, someone's got to look after them, right? Yeah. So they're going to land in Azure. If you suddenly land 50 servers in Azure and there's no one there to look after them, it delays landing the next 50. So again, brushing all the way back to skills, make sure the operations teams are ready to pick those servers up, and that's going to help you move quicker. So it is a broad brush. It depends how big your infrastructure is. We've seen clients move 400 similar type servers. So let's say file servers, all departmental file servers, all in different places over the country, move those into Azure within a matter of 4-6 weeks. We've seen people with the same amount of servers take 6 months. So, it does depend on your appetite for change within the business and your risk profile.
Okay. Perfect. Well, let's touch on the elephant in the room then, which is always cost. Obviously, every project has some sort of cost implication to it, but particularly when you're making that move to the cloud, often it necessitates a move from maybe a traditional CapEx spend model into more of an OpEx spend model, that idea of sort of subscription type approaches. How do organisations go about sort of understanding that true cost of migrating to the cloud, and then once they've got there, how do they control and maintain those costs to make sure that they're not paying more than they need to?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that comes up in every conversation, I think, as part of the Azure migration, because it is often a change for people. How do we forecast costs? How do we budget for this? So I think if we were to break this down into two chunks and try and sort of link it back to our last point around, is it a straightforward lift and shift, or actually we're doing modernisation? Usually for the pre-migration, if you like, we're looking at what are the licensing options for a start? Is this going to be done under a Microsoft Enterprise agreement? Is it going to be done as pay-as-you-go pricing? And there are advantages to doing an enterprise agreement. If you're at that kind of scale, there might be discounts or special agreements that can be done with Microsoft that can save to a certain level of commitment. There are some unique to Azure offers as well that we can leverage. So examples I would give would be around something called Azure Hybrid Usage Benefit, which allows us to use our existing license investments with software assurance and to take those to the cloud and just pay for the base compute cost. And that gives us some quite significant savings over the pay-as-you-go price. And if you couple that with reserved instances or reserved compute, terms that are used interchangeably, that allows us to make upfront commitments for resources on a 1 or a 3 year basis on Windows virtual machines, on SQL databases. And those two together can reach discounts of up to 80% over the pay-as-you-go prices. Wow. So it's quite significant. So there are some levers we can use, if you like, to actually bring the price down. But obviously, we talked about before, as part of any migration, we're going to be doing some right sizing. So what we've got today in our data center might be way underutilized. So we might be able to right size our virtual machines that we're only paying exactly for what we need. Of course, we can still scale that. We've got the agility in the cloud to move that price around based on what we need. But I think our customers are more rest assured that because we're constantly looking at those costs, that we're only going to be using exactly what we need at any point in time. And I think a good use case is during COVID when, unfortunately, a number of organisations had to go through the furlough process. But of course, not all those resources were needed in the cloud, so we were able to turn the volume down, so to speak, on some of that resource to right-size the resources for the organisation at that time. And that's one of the great advantages of the cloud. I would go on to say that, once we've kind of done the migration, how do we get the governance around it? Well, Paul's point around the landing zone is the first point in this, because that gives us the governance guardrails. It gives us the opportunity to make sure we've got to avoid costly mistakes of standing up the wrong resources in the wrong regions that can quickly attract cost, and tagging resources so they can be much more visually analysed within some of the tool sets within the Azure portal. So within Azure, we've got a native tool called Cost Management and Billing, and an Azure Advisor. And by looking at these advisories and monitoring and managing our cost, Azure will tell us where it thinks we can make cost savings. And of course, through a process, we can act upon those to bring the cost down, depending on the needs of the business. So it's great, going back to that skilling point before, having the team in place and accountability for making sure that we're doing those cost reviews on a regular basis, looking at Azure Advisor, can we use reserved instances, or do we need to use a variable cost? So that there's a whole bunch of levers we can really use once in Azure, but it's all about ongoing management. And I think the final point I would make around Azure as well is it's the architectural decisions that we make. So it might be that a certain tier of database is required at a low cost for a database that's used infrequently. We wouldn't necessarily want to be using a business critical hyperscale tier for a database that's just running payroll and access once a month, for example. So architectural decisions through partners and the right expertise can bring down the price quite considerably. So I appreciate there's quite a lot to take in there, but it is quite a common part of the conversation.
No, and I think that's a great start for today as well. I think we've answered some of the more common questions that often come up when people are starting the migration. So thank you very much for your time, gents.
Thanks, Rob.
Yeah, thank you.
Next up, we have James Lewis and Melanie Best, who are going to help you understand the true cost of moving to Azure and how best to build your business case.
Okay, so we're going to talk about the Azure costs when we're looking at building a business case today, and that will be the tangible, intangible costs, some of the easy ones and some of the harder costs that maybe aren't quite as obvious.
So we work with a lot of customers trying to understand what it's going to cost to build this out. And it's really important that you plan effectively. So there are some things that are really obvious. Hardware and software, you know what it costs, you know how much you paid for it, you know your write-down period. Power and cooling, you know how much you're paying, you know what your data center costs you. We also have a good estimate on how much it might cost you to get to Azure. The problem with that is it doesn't cover quite a lot of the costs that are out there, so there are plenty more to think about.
Absolutely. So then that leads us into some of the intangible costs that we know from building a business case. So some of those being access to best practices using the technology that's available. And with that comes the efficiencies for the end users. So making sure it's ease of use, ease of access, and those sorts of efficiencies that it brings. Also that evergreen mindset, that change of always being on the latest version and being up to date. I think it's that adoption of that change is key. And then also we find that IT and business need to be aligned together in terms of their strategies. So we need to make sure that, there's not two separate tangents going on at the moment. So when we're building that business case, we need to really understand the business in that sense.
And that's right. And beyond that, even when we think about the tangible things that you can bring into the business case, there are some things that are really hard to define. So Microsoft funding, as a normal, regular person, you wouldn't know what you can get. So if you work with a partner and work closely with Microsoft, actually there's lots more funding available to you. And if you don't plan for that and don't seek it out, you won't get it. So therefore, you're missing out on quite a large sum of money. But as we start to think about DevOps, the people that we've got, the things that they need to do, there's a skills transition that we need to go through, and we might need to co-source some other skills from other places. So we need to plan that effectively to have something that's sustainable and supportable. When we think about how much we're paying, there can be significant differences in the amount you pay for a single VM based on whether it's a reserved instance, whether you've got elastic scalability built into the model. So all of those things need to be planned out effectively as well. But we also need to think about mergers and acquisitions. There's a lot of that happening at the moment, so we need to make sure that we have the ability to change what we need to suit our business as and when it happens. And then most importantly for me, where does this fit with everything else? It's great having an Azure footprint, but actually we need to collaborate. There are users that need to use the services that the applications provide. There are customers that want to buy and receive services from us. So we need to think all of that through so it lands at the right time for everybody.
Absolutely, and then I think moving on to some of the really hard intangibles, so these are the things that we're really picking up on today that they're not ever so obvious when we're building the business case. So I think the starting point for that is the roadmap. So a move to Microsoft Azure isn't just that. You know, there's so much more of the technology that we can take advantage of. So it's almost planning that short, medium and term strategy within the business case to enable the efficiencies that I spoke about earlier. And we've also then think about our actual customers and opportunities to access maybe new markets, geographic locations, maybe a launch of a new product, whatever it might be. That DevOps platform allows that flexibility for them to be able to do that quickly and serve the customers. The CapEx, OpEx model, so again, it's fundamentally coming down to how the business is financed. So if they're very typically financed from a CapEx perspective and they're being almost forced into the OpEx perspective from a cloud service solution, then we need to be mindful of that when we build the business case out, and that's sometimes quite hard to justify as well. And then engaging with customers, of course, that's touching on making the technology ease of use, obviously making them able to engage with customers a little bit better. Again, something that's quite hard to actually quantify, I guess, when we put the business case together, but it's there with the technology. And then finally, in terms of the level of business understanding, I think it's really important that we understand what the journey of that organisation's on. So it could be that they're already cloud first, strategically thinking about it, so they're already on that journey. But actually they could be more of the bricks and mortar infrastructure side of it. So again, the business case has to be better aligned to help understand the technology around that and why the move to cloud is important. And again, the true cost of that.
So yeah, that's really interesting. So what that allows us to think about is it's not just about building it, it's how to land it well with everybody. So stakeholders are inside the business, but also customers and your users. So when we work with clients to do this, it doesn't mean that everything that we talked about is relevant. We've got to find the things that are relevant for you as an organisation, and we can help you build that business case out and build out the plan and time to value. And there are some obvious things, as we talked about, that you would expect to see. But some of the things that you wouldn't expect to see necessarily can really make a fundamental difference. And so that's why the effort is so important to understand some of those harder to work out intangible and tangible benefits that you can get. So I think you've got a couple of examples from customers that really would help everybody understand.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think coming back to the point there about the level of understanding within the business. So again, if you're going from that traditional infrastructure, that's, the way that they're funded from a CapEx perspective, also the way they've always thought about technology, and that transition of actually making sure that the business is aware of the efficiencies this technology brings, that business case being brought together is very much focused on those intangibles rather than the actual tangibles technology. So again, that's sort of tailoring the business case to almost align to the level of the understanding of the business. And then also, where does that fit within the overall strategy that we've got here? So when we work on cloud migration projects, of course, we're working with internal IT teams that have a number of other projects underway, perhaps, and therefore we need to make sure we align the cloud migration strategy with other projects that's going on at the time as well. So we need to be very mindful of that, and I think that's become more prevalent in COVID pandemic times on the basis that, where does it fit in overall strategy? It used to be a long-term strategy, and actually it's been brought forward to allow flexibility for end users to gain their systems from wherever they are, that flexible working. So yeah, there's a couple of examples there where they've come into the business model when we've been pulling it together.
Well, I think, in addition to that, if you think about the extremes that might exist, so if you've got a carve out, you've got a certain amount of time to do stuff and you need to have it done within that amount of time and you've got money behind you. But if you're an owner operator, actually you're spending your own money. So justifying both of those things is a very different thing. So these are always personal to the business that you're in. And we need to make sure that we go as far as we can to understand the nuances of your business to get it right.
Absolutely. And I guess we start with on-ramp, so traditional waterfall approach in terms of the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework. So starting with the discover phase, so an assessment of what you have today but where you want to be, and ultimately finding the gap analysis between the two and then working that through. And then moving on to the design phase is then building it together in terms of a low-level, high-level design, all the typical things you'd expect when you're looking at a cloud migration. And then we go on to the planning, so the actual planning of the project. So making sure that you've got the right people with the right capabilities at the right time planned into the project. So it's almost all hands on deck for getting the cloud migration done. And then there's the onboarding of the end users and the whole organisation to bring them on board with the whole cloud migration project. But I guess that's actually where we start when we look at the evergreen mindset.
That's right, and actually the on-ramp is the easy bit. So that's more like a waterfall project, things that we've done many, many times over. So as we move into the new world, we need to think about what we're going to be doing all of the time, and this is constantly changing. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to understand how we're going to monitor the resources that we're using, the services that we're supplying, and ensuring that they are what we need them to be. We then think about the planning. So how do we absorb planning into the next iteration of what we need to build? So we need to have signals and feedback from all parts of the business and stakeholders that allow us to code that through the system. So we've got a set of languages that we know we're going to use. We're going to use as little code and low code or no code as we can. But actually, how do we convert ideas into technology? Well, we do that through the coding and then the building with the DevOps team. So we need to have the right DNA in that team, whether that is internal, external or co-sourced, to ensure that we can actually deliver on those promises. Testing now is a totally different thing. So we used to have finite amounts of testing, so you've got user acceptance testing and functional testing. Actually, we now need IT champions. We now need people all over the business and outside the business to signal if there are any problems, because things are changing a lot. So that's a totally different mindset. We then need to think about enterprise release management. So how do we ensure that we deliver these things accurately and correctly when they're needed, with rollback plans and back-out plans if they're required? And that therefore takes us through into building that rhythm. So we can't do that as IT anymore. We can't wait for a change freeze. We can't wait for something to happen. We now need to consider what's the financial rhythm of the business. When are we busy? When are we quiet? When are our customers busy? When are they quiet? And those rhythms need to be built into the cadence of what we're going to do. And that then leads into the final target operating model, where we make sure we've got that right DNA in the right place at the right time to make everything sustainable and deliver real value to our businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the starting point for this is, what do we take with us and what do we actually leave behind? And I guess if we focus on the top of the funnel, it's all around actually eliminating anything that we don't need anymore. So it's almost trying to simplify the infrastructure for the end users, but also best fit for the future of the organisation. You know, things change, as you mentioned, we need to keep up with that pace. So it's all ultimately, we move into the next part of the funnel in terms of software as a service. So we look at options that we have for some of the application and workloads that we do need to take with us on that journey. And some of the most obvious things when we go through this process is looking at leveraging some of the subscriptions we've already made, of course. So an example of the Microsoft stack, we've got some examples here around SharePoint Online. That's the most obvious to me when I speak to my clients about, you know, how we leverage some of that subscription that's already been invested in. But also we move back to the software as a service and some of the third-party vendors. It may be that they've not quite developed a software yet and it's in their roadmap to develop it. So we have to think about, okay, that's our long-term strategy, but what do we do today? So as we go further down the funnel, we then focus on what then we can do in terms of other options outside of software as a service. And using my example there, you know, the vendor's not quite ready as a software as a service application, therefore we can look at infrastructure as a service to host it for the time being. So that's, again, just working through these different options and what's best fit for the organisation. And then finally, I think we've got the point of anything on premise. We see this is becoming few and far between in terms of anything left on premise, but we do sometimes see that, you know, there's a legacy application that just needs to be kept where it is for whatever reason. And again, what I'm trying to say here, it's not one size fits all. It's actually trying to work it through to see what that organisation needs. And also, I think a lot of clients take a step back and say, what applications do we need and what don't we need? And it's a perfect opportunity to do that, to drive the business forward, I guess.
And you raise a really good point there. You know, as we start to rationalise that down, we need to think about the things that we're going to take. And it's really easy to stop early because as with many big migrations and changes of paradigm, it gets harder the further we go. So we can see that, you know, we can probably get 35 to 45% of the workloads moved without too much effort. But actually, the real value comes in the harder ones to move, because we've got to re-architect them or completely transform them to be relevant to our business today. So it's really important that you build out that roadmap, because if you don't understand your costs over time, and therefore you could be going back to the board to ask for more money than you thought you needed to start with.
Yeah, and I see that as well. I get that question asked a lot in terms of, it's much easier to lift and shift, yes, but we really need to develop that strategy going forward to see the real value. So absolutely, I see that a lot. So
how do we work out what we put on that roadmap? So it's really important that we do this 5 R's exercise early on. A lot of clients don't want to do it because it's complicated and it's hard. But if you don't, you're leaving possibly technical debt and a problem later on for yourself. So the first thing that we're going to look at doing is obviously looking at the things that we can just retire. So Active Directory, domain controllers, sprawl, Exchange servers, SharePoint servers, etc. We can get rid of those and move those into other applications so we don't need them anymore. We can then think about the rehosting of things that we need to move quickly or we need to think about, but actually they're a bit complicated, so we might want to move and then transform later. We then think about refactoring, so we're starting to get into the real value now. So we're able to take those systems and make them more appropriate to our processes. So it's harder to do, but more value comes back with it. We then think about re-architecting. So if we're now into the world of SaaS and PaaS, so we're starting to think about bigger platforms, we're moving more towards the ERP end of the scale and line of business applications. But this is where the real value is, because this is where, if we can get these right, it will take more effort, but the rewards will be significantly greater, because everything will be connected. We'll be able to use that data and those systems across the organisations more effectively. So I think you've got a couple of examples of clients that have gone down this road.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when we look at this, we need to go back to the point about IT and business strategies aligning. So I often see that, you know, internal IT teams may be looking at sitting on the left-hand side of this spectrum in terms of, you know, lift and shift, and we'll, you know, transform later, whereas the business is driving more change quicker. And actually, you know, it's that clash of the two that we need to sort of manage that balance between, really. And then the flip of that, I actually see it where the IT teams are pushing on the change and the business is holding back on the basis that they may be afraid of the disruption, or, you know, whatever it might be that they're not quite sure of. Again, coming back to the intangible efforts and true cost, you know, some of that can be very disruptive if not done properly. So again, it's just trying to find that balance between the two to make sure that, you know, the whole organisation strategy is aligned, really.
Great. So we next need to think about the target operating model. I think the thing that's really hard here is that we look at the people that we've got in our business and we know that they've got some skills, and we don't ever want to assume that they haven't got the skills that we need moving forward, and we're frightened about outsourcing, or we're frightened about bringing something else in. And you need to not worry about that at all. What we do need to do is we need to plan. So if we don't have those skills, what does the change look like, and how do we acquire those skills over what period of time? And it might be that we source those skills short term from somewhere else. But we need to lock them down into those things that we want to hold on to forever because they're important and core to our business, those that can be changeable, and those that actually we can leave with the vendor or the partner permanently because actually it's not core to what we do. So those things are really important to think through, and we can help you do that. And it's not just about Azure. As we move into this modern way of working, actually this applies to everything that you do. But also remember that your people and staff will thank you for thinking this through, because that's where they want to be working. That's their progression. That's how they acquire new skills. So again, a couple of examples of customers that have gone on this journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's fair to say this is a learning journey. You know, I've seen a lot of customers where they have wanted to learn the skills around the Azure and the wider, some of the 5 R's we've been talking about, and take on some of that themselves. And that's excellent to be able to, you know, bring bigger skills into their, you know, mindset. However, I think what we need to do is manage that ultimately and help where it's appropriate to do so. And that's where the partner comes in terms of, you're right, it needs to be a moving feast. It's always changing, it's always evolving. And I think it's understanding the responsibilities of every individual within the target operating model is key. But as I say, I see either us helping out from a deep technical point of view, or actually the flip of that, and actually internal IT systems teams coming to us and talking about the first line support and saying, whilst we focus on this cloud migration project, we don't want our team focusing on the low level support for our end users. So can we work with people to focus on that? And absolutely. And I think again that it's just that change and that adoption to the target operating model is important. It's not just set in stone, I guess, is the key.
Yeah, and whatever level you go to, it's just important that you've got one that's relevant to your business.
Correct, yeah.
So the thing, I guess, that we would want people to take away from this are ask yourselves the big questions. Think it through, because if you don't, then you will have some shocks down the line, because that on-ramp that we described is relatively easy compared to the rest if you're not prepared for it. So the first thing that we always do with a client is understand those things that are most important to them, and you have to put these things in order. Everybody we talk to wants everything done as fast as possible at the lowest cost, with the highest quality, with the lowest disruption, with the most transformation. Of course you do, but actually there will be compromise.
Yeah.
Whichever path you choose, you will have to compromise. Like buying a house, you can't have it all unless your budget is absolutely unreal. So the thing there is, these are personal to you as an organisation, so you must sit down and go through this exercise, because it will inform a lot of your later decisions. And this is just an order that we see typically, but it's not always that way.
Absolutely. So time typically sits as a compelling reason to move to cloud solutions and services. Maybe that's a migration out of a data center or something, but also coming back to my earlier point about the COVID pandemic, and it's been a reason for a lot of organizations adopting some of this cloud technology that they had on their roadmap in the future. But the flip of that, actually, just to give you another example of the way that these priorities lay out, if you've got a 24/7 organisation, that level of disruption to users will be key for them, and because level of disruption to their users means disruption to customers. Therefore, that's not a situation we want to be in. So that comes as a high priority, and therefore, as you say, it's that balance then between cost and time. So when can we do the work if we need to be 24/7 on, and the cost is associated to do that within that time frame as well.
Okay. So one of the things that we also need to think about is, how do we break the waves of activity up and the work up? So one of the analogies that Microsoft use is the crawl, walk, run. So if you think about crawl, what we're trying to do there is just build things that are hygienic, make sure that we've got security, we've got governance, we know how we're going to use things, but it's not particularly transformational yet. We then move into a walk phase where we start to think about, actually, we've now got control over everything we want. We're starting to hear signals from the business, from customers, from IT and from stakeholders as to what this might now mean. And we're now in a position to be able to start to affect real change. And then finally, when we're in the run phase, we're talking about delighting everybody inside and outside of the business, because we can affect change really quickly based on the feedback we're getting, and then we can change again, so we can continually iterate. So that might be something to think about as well.
Absolutely. And we see different organisations do this at a different pace, in terms of how quickly they move through the crawl, walk, run phase. But also we need to consider the migrate and transform. I think the key to this is what we're saying is whether you migrate and then transform, or transform and then migrate, it doesn't matter, so long as the two are done in some capacity. So it's all that planning ahead. Again, that's just coming full circle back to when we were talking about the 5 Rs and how we want to approach this. But one thing I would, as a key takeaway, it's not migrate or transform, it's the two together, and they have to work in sync ultimately.
Yeah. And then I think, I hear Agile and I think of a new way of working, of building a resource model. A lot of people hear Agile and think that's an excuse not to build a project plan. And I think we have to remember that the waterfall way of doing things is excellent for some things, where it's output based, we might want a fixed price or we want a fixed outcome, but it doesn't allow for iteration as we finding things out as we're delivering. So the Agile model is really about building that sprint mechanism, having the digital feedback loops so that we understand what we're trying to do, and allowing slight adjustments in course as we're going. So that's more aligned to the evergreen mindset. It's uncomfortable for some people, but it's really important that we do start to embrace that thinking. But you need to decide as an organisation what's going to work for you.
Absolutely, and I think finally we've touched on the point around who does what. And actually it's more about who does what, but who's best at doing what. So making sure that the skills and responsibilities are those who, who are able to add the real value to this cloud migration, and working through the target operating model to ensure that, that's fit for purpose at that point in time. So yeah, it's all around, whose responsibility is what.
So there's a lot for people to think about there, and I guess whether it's building a full-blown deep business case or actually just building a light one but with some guidance, I think we'd like everybody to consider all of those things that we've talked about, because it's really easy to ignore them and move on and have a shot later.
Prior to today, James Lewis caught up with Steve Jolly from Tysers to discuss their recent Azure migration and the challenges and benefits they found moving to the cloud.
Hi Steve, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. We're really keen to get the customer view and opinion on what a journey and migration to Azure might look like, the good, the bad, and most importantly, where it's going to take your business over the next 12 to 18 months. So, first question for you, what was the most important thing in your thinking when moving to Azure? Were you getting away from something, or were you moving towards something?
James, it was a combination of both. When I joined Tysers 18 months ago, we a little bit of history. We were a myriad of businesses that have been loosely stitched together from an integration perspective. But what we were really struggling with, that was immediate to me, was our ability to grow and to scale. We had mostly on-prem infrastructure, and that really inhibited us from growing at scale. So we very much quickly looked at how we can change some of that and move ourselves and our infrastructure and our applications up into the cloud that enabled us to give us that ability. So, but it also it enabled a couple of other things for us. So consolidation, and to get a much clearer position in terms of a three-tier architecture model, and to remove a lot of the spaghetti that had been built in the past that frankly was very, very difficult to support and maintain. So in short, it's a little bit about looking backwards. It was really about how we then grow and scale this business, and how we can do that in an environment that enables us to react in a far quicker, more efficient way.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Steve. So it sounds like we're dealing with some technical debt that we had. We're pulling together cultural transformation, but we're also making sure that as we move forward, everything remains relevant, not just for your customers and users, but IT are also able to support the landscape and ensure the whole organisation is moving forward at pace.
Absolutely, James, and that's why we chose Microsoft Azure, because hopefully I'll be in the organisation for a few years, but whether I am or I'm not, we wanted to make certain that we partnered with the right organisations to help us move there, and no doubt we'll come on to that. But then it was the technology stack that we wanted to move, and Microsoft was the clear winner for us in that regard, because I am a fan of making certain that you've got most of your eggs in fewer baskets, and therefore Azure and the investment that's been put on that, the scalability of that, the ability to manage and maintain that going forward, the licensing model that underpins with that, it was in a much clearer state for us, and that's why we wanted to go in that direction. And yes, we had a considerable amount of technical debt that we have to manage and maintain as part of this journey, and some of that is around understanding what that looks like versus picking it up and moving it and seeing what happens. And that might sound a little maverick, but actually it's a great way of actually trying to understand where your challenges are. But that's what we've done as part of the project that Content and Cloud have helped us drive forward.
Fantastic. So if we were to zoom right out, what opportunities do you believe the Azure platform has opened up for your business?
Well, we're not quite there yet, so you're right, and because we're right in the middle of migrating our infrastructure to Azure. We're picking up two particularly archaic applications right now, and moving that into Azure. But we've moved development, we've moved UAT, we've learned a lot of great things as a result of that, and we're probably 3 or 4 weeks away now for moving our production capability. So really excited, because those applications are 20 years old, and when they were built, I think the cloud was truly a thing in the sky at that point. So there was no thinking around mobility and latency in that regard. But what does it give us in terms of going forward? Well, Tysers, and I don't think I'm about to excite anyone out. We are very much driven about being a data-driven, digital first, digital forward thinking business. We sit on a huge amount of information, and we interact with our clients on a daily basis, as well as the insurance markets in terms of placing business. Having our information and our application set, our data warehouse, all in the Azure cloud, all with the right tooling sat across it, gives us the ability to do exactly that. We can be data first, we can be evidence driven, we can really interact with our clients in a far quicker, faster, more efficient way. And we think that's going to be a differentiator for us in the mid-tier insurance broking market. We can't compete with the big guns in terms of Marsh, Aon, Willis, etc. But we recognise that. But where our skill set is about relationship based and data driven, and being really clear about what only do we provide and do for our clients, but what the industries they're in and how we can pull in not only our own internal data, but our external data as well. And that's exactly what we're building in the Azure platform.
Actually, we see that across all verticals at the moment. Like I say, there's a common theme for us. So why is Azure, not another public platform, the right choice for you?
That's quite an easy question to answer. Back to the eggs in fewer baskets. We are an M365 shop. We are utilizing the tools that provide within M365, like Outlook, of course, Teams, SharePoint Online, Yammer, which we will utilize, Delve. So Azure was the logical decision, staying within that Microsoft shop, if you will. But I felt as well the other piece that was really important to us, and I'm not discrediting any of the other cloud platform providers, but the money and the investment that's gone into the security aspects of Azure and the performance aspects of Azure, the business continuity that provides you. If something went wrong with the Azure platform, bearing in mind with the Xbox and 6 billion users around the world or whatever it is, I think they'd be able to be reacting in a far quicker way than most other providers. And we're making use of those security tools that Azure and M365 bring in unison together. And that clear question is about scale and growth. It's also about being safe and protecting your data and understanding how you're interacting. And that for me is where Azure was top of the tree.
Okay, thank you. The Microsoft term for that is better together. Why wouldn't you leverage the $1 billion a year investment they make in security, right? So once you've made the decision that Azure is the right platform, how do you then make sure that your team and the business and your customer base get the best from that decision?
That's a great question. What we're trying to do with that is not just about what we're moving up into the Azure cloud, it's how you get there as well. And I know it's a slightly off topic, but we're utilizing, for example, Windows Virtual Desktop, which is what we're going to be using as our strategic remote working tool. And if I can broaden out that question, the world's evolving, with COVID and what's happened with the global pandemic, and therefore, how we work, where we work, how we judge outcomes is now fundamentally different. So giving our staff and our clients and our markets the ability to access us in a far easier, cleaner way, being able to support that, what we call hybrid remote working, and the ability to judge people on outcomes, not that they're in an office from 9 until 5. It's what they're delivering, how they're delivering it, and how we can best support them. I'm a huge fan of the collaboration tools that the M365 tool set brings. I've pushed very hard within my own function, running IT here at Tysers, to use and to collaborate on documents and to share through Teams. We're about to go on to Teams telephony as well, so the death of the desk phone. It's been that's how we're empowering our business to be, to hold any time, any place, anywhere. For those that are old enough to remember that phrase, that is critical for us, and Microsoft gives us the ability to do that.
Fantastic. And yes, I am old enough to remember the Martini principle. If you could go back 2 years in time and potentially go forward 2 years in time, what would you say to yourself about the decision and what you're going to get out of the platform?
If I was to advise myself 18 months ago, I'm not sure I'd have taken the job. No. On a serious note, I was brought into Tysers on the back end of not just about how we can become a robust, scalable and accessible business. It was about looking at our agenda around digital and being a digitally enabled business that's data driven. And I've got a lot of background in those areas from previous lives. So 18 months ago, to answer that question, that was very much at the forefront of my thinking. And therefore, in order to be a digital first, data driven organization, we have to have our ability to access that, manipulate that, utilize that information, surface it and report on it. You can't do that with legacy infrastructure, with legacy applications, with data held in multiple places. You have to harmonize, consolidate, and then you have to put some stewardship and protection around that. Azure is critical for that. So 18 months ago, that was where I was thinking. Tysers has been on quite a journey in that time from an operational perspective and technology, but we're pretty much, I'd say within 6 months we're going to be there in that regard, and that's hugely exciting. So that draws me on to your question about what's the future looking forward 18 months. It's really exciting actually, because our marketplace in particular is changing, it's evolving, and therefore we've got to try and think about how we stay on track with that, and even if we can be a bit ahead of it. So what do I mean by that? So data is key in any industry, but in insurance broking in particular, it's about us knowing everything we can to help our clients place the right business, have the right level of cover, and be forward thinking and future proof, and not rest on our laurels in that traditional way of insurance broking, whereby it's up for renewal, let's tweak it because you've either grown or you've deepened or something, and then we'll put it in the bottom drawer and we'll move on again. No, it's far more than that. We want to be a credible partner to that client, especially in the mid-tier that we're in. That's what we want. We want a relationship that we're more than an insurance broker. We're almost an advisory partner to that client. And with the data that we have ourselves for that client and for that marketplace and what's externally available, having our ability to harmonize all that using the Azure platform, accessing it through WVD, using things like SharePoint Online to have a hub, if you will, to access that, gives us the ability to do that. And then the marketplace will change. It's talking about, from a Lloyd's market, the digital spine that the latest Lloyd's digital revolution is talking about with Blueprint 2, if those of you in the market know it. That digital spine and that core data record, we're at the forefront of that, and therefore we will be on par, if not ahead of it, when that happens. So that enables us to utilize what's coming through the market as well. So looking forward 18 months, doing what we're doing now enables us to be that, and therefore future-proofs our business for who knows, right? Because tomorrow things change. Let's not hope COVID-20 happens, but for the next 3 to 5 years, the foundation that we're building is going to be very strong.
Fantastic. So that gives you that forward-leaning ability as an organisation, and it will eradicate that technical debt over time. So you're ensuring that you're getting the best out of your people and your customer base, and you're thinking less about the technology and actually more about what you do as a core business. Final question for you. The importance of a business case and planning for the change. What would you say is the most important thing?
So, and this is where, in partnership with Content and Cloud, it's gone very well, because trying to describe a journey that wraps in our Azure, my Azure driven requirements, and also the wider components around the access of that with Windows Virtual Desktop, the landing zone that we're looking to build with the fresh platform which is underpinned on SharePoint Online, using with your partnership, the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework, which has been vital for us in helping us shape what we're building in not just in the business case, but then how we've enacted that was vital. I needed to bring my board on this journey and describe to them what it brings, but to make it clear in non-technical language what this brings us. So that business case that we worked on, we buying Tysers and Content and Cloud in collaboration, enabled me to do that. It enabled me to set the scene. It enabled me to release, dare I say, the funding to then get into a solid discovery position, which then enabled me to iterate the business case to show the value of what we could bring and the cost components of that. It was so important, but also then the ability to do this in an iterative way. The business case doesn't necessarily always come up with all the answers. So therefore, I tend to use the justification side of things as well, James. So, I'm a fan of trying to say, look, this is where we're going. This is why we're doing it. These are the opportunities it brings, the problems it solves. But also, we won't know all the answers. So let's go into this, bite this off one piece at a time, which we're doing. It's crudely, it's a 1-year project, this, and we're not done and dusted at the end of that because, by the way, the business evolves as well, right? So the importance of the business case is vital, and it does drive the mindset as well as the decision. But the decision isn't a full and final one at that point. It's how you then keep reflecting through that as you go on the journey, what we're learning as a result of what we find, and also then how the business is also pivoting along the way, because we're a fast-moving business. Even in my 18 months here, we bought 2 other small tier brokers, and we're integrating those. So the estate doesn't stay the same. So how does our platform and project evolve as a result? And I know I've mentioned it a couple of times, I'm sorry, but COVID was a quite an interesting dynamic that we had to manage. And I'm so glad that actually, I'm not saying through visionary foresight from the CIO, but doing this is really creating that foundational platform that enables us to handle our working environment in a pandemic situation. If it happened again, we'd be in a much better position. We're not out of it, are we? But that hybrid remote way of working, if you haven't got plans or doing things around this, you need to get on board.
So thanks, Stephen. Really, really appreciate your time. I think it's going to be really interesting for people to hear what it's like client side to go through this journey.
Next up, we have Chris O'Brien and Nick Isherwood, who are going to help you understand the role of applications and data in your Azure transformation journey.
So Chris, we hear a lot about the term application modernisation and how the cloud underpins this, but what does it actually mean in practical terms to an organisation?
The way I think about this is in 3 things primarily. So the first is agility, the ability for a team or a developer within an organisation to quickly stand up infrastructure or a test environment, a dev environment, without the blockers that sometimes get in the way of moving fast. And I think in the early days of the cloud, 7 or 8 years ago, some of this would have given a heart attack to somebody, an IT manager that was thinking that meant a high bill, being out of control.
Yes.
But these days, we have the right kind of governance and control measures to make sure that we can give this agility to people within the organisation, but not with the risk of running up high costs. The next area is the platform services. So thinking about things that I can't easily do on premises, perhaps bringing different types of database into the picture. I've got relational databases like Azure SQL, document databases like Cosmos DB, but a whole array of rich services to support the applications and systems that I might build these days. Cognitive services, application insights for monitoring, the ability to move data around in different ways with Databricks and Synapse, and just a whole series of infrastructure that I can't easily use. The other area is really around elasticity and the fact that I can pay for what I consume, I can dial things up, I can dial things down. And what Microsoft are doing here is providing me a really flexible model where in something like Azure Functions, I'm literally only paying per execution. I get 1 million executions free per month, lots of amazing services that I don't get when I'm doing things on premises. The journey to migrating to the cloud is simpler than ever for applications. So previously there was a lot of work to do around analysis, moving through understanding what the code was doing in the application, how it was interacting with data. But Microsoft are now bringing better tools for this. So there's the App Service Migration Assistant that can automatically analyze my applications, give me recommendations as to how they translate to PaaS services, but often actually do those steps for me. So take my code, put it in Azure App Service, take some of my data, put it in Azure SQL, and go through an automated process that I can validate and check. And it's the same for virtual machines. So if I have applications on premises at the moment, they're running in virtual machines, what we can do with Azure Migrate is move through these assess, plan, migrate and optimize steps in a controlled way where the tooling is taking care of more of the problem than ever before.
How then would you say that organisations are using Azure services to really underpin the application modernisation journey?
I think there are a few different ways, but some of the themes here are migrating a legacy web application that exists already, perhaps something that's hosted in IaaS, runs on on-premises SQL Server, maybe in a data center in a virtualized way, but still not taking full advantage of cloud services. So, that's a common theme, bringing those kind of applications to the cloud. Another one is extending Microsoft 365. So using Azure as the back end, perhaps for a Power App or a Power Automate solution, maybe tapping into some of the process capability around Logic Apps, but ultimately using that as the back end to something that exists in Microsoft 365, because that's the way that platform is extended. And the third way is cloud native apps. So building something from the ground up in Azure, no kind of migration, but the dev team or architect starting from scratch in Azure. And often what this looks like is taking advantage of App Service, that's where my API lives, that's where my web application lives, bringing things over in data, so I'm building up on Azure SQL services, or maybe using some of the other data platforms, Cosmos DB. And ultimately, what we're doing is building a net new application that can take advantage of the elasticity, performance, scalability of the cloud. Now, there are other things as well, so maybe we're doing something very specific, maybe around mobile development, maybe around containerization. Some of these technologies that are native to the cloud help me take care of specific scenarios. Mobile, we get the support of event hubs, the ability to distribute large numbers of notifications and deal with mobile specific scenarios. Containerization, the ability for me to take something that exists already, not necessarily move it to PaaS services in the cloud, but pick it up, put it in a box that isn't a virtual machine, and give me some flexibility that I don't have already. But what we really get with these scenarios is the support from a very rich application services platform. I can build in any language that I like, so whether it's .NET, PHP or Python, the support is there and I've got a wide range of tools to choose from.
Chris, that all sounds really great, but from a customer perspective, is there any use cases that spring to mind where some of the things that you've just mentioned can be a bit more brought to life?
Sure, so maybe a couple of recent cases. The first is an insurance broker. They have a legacy application, it's their market sheet application that brokers use, and it runs in a data center. It's powered by SQL Server, it's hosted in IaaS, and the company, with our help, are migrating this into PaaS services in the cloud. So the application comes into Azure App Service, we don't have to worry about patching, we don't have to worry about scalability, we don't even have to worry about all of the security things that we do on premises. This is a secure web application. Azure App Service supports HTTPS, and the kind of things that we used to worry and spend so much time about on premises, optimization. My CV, I think, used to have 2 pages 10 years ago on Azure on app optimization, and now it's a slider in Azure, and that's the simplification that we get. The other example that springs to mind is a UK house builder, and what they're doing is using Azure as the back end for a solution that's in Microsoft 365, And this is used to contracharge subcontractors that have done some defective work. So there's a Power App that collects a photograph that goes into Azure Data Services. The data is stored there. But there's a process powered by Azure Logic Apps that takes this through a workflow of being approved by different departments, different people contributing information, some decision making, and ultimately integration with finance systems. Now previously, that was the work of probably 5 or 10 people from different departments, all handled by email, all handled on attachments, lots of inconsistency and manual processing. And now, at least this is one process that is taken away and these people can focus on more valuable activities.
Okay, so even over the last year, I've seen an explosion in the use of Azure Cognitive Services when it comes to application modernisation. And I was wondering whether you could explain a bit more about how some of our customers are bringing these cognitive services into their application modernisation journey.
Yeah. So cognitive services is really some of the classic things that we're starting to think more and more about for AI. Image recognition, video processing, document processing, starting to understand what's in my documents and basically untrapping the information from them, but also language translations, things like that. Some of the places that we see this used is really around getting more value from my existing data. So perhaps taking the images and videos that I've accumulated over the years, giving them to Azure Cognitive Services so that it can automatically tag and create a description for these images and videos. Maybe I can generate a transcript from a video or even old calls that we did a few years ago, but have valuable content and information in them. The problem with all these artifacts is that they're not searchable. We run them through Azure Cognitive Services, we get some text representation of them, and now the search engine can find them. So I'm starting to get a lot more value from content that exists in my environment. Another case is thinking about how we deal with documents and how we collaborate. So we're starting to see Azure Cognitive Services be baked into other bits of the Microsoft ecosystem. So in Microsoft 365, we have technologies like Viva Topics, SharePoint Syntex. They're powered by Azure Cognitive Services underneath. But what they allow me to do is extract the valuable content from documents so that it's not just trapped inside there. I can easily scan a list of 100 documents, get a sense of what each document is about without needing to open each one. So that's a little bit about app modernization, Nick. And I know that you've spent a lot of time working with clients on data. And it seems to me that we often see app modernization and data modernization mentioned in the same breath. Why is that? Can you explain the relationship?
Yeah, exactly that. I mean, it's all part of the same kind of transformational journey and transformation experience, really. But I think the exciting thing is, we've got to consider the opportunity we've got with data. That's the main thing to think about here. And lots of clients share the same challenges. We've got lots of data that's created organically, might be created through merger and acquisition. It's in different silos across the business. But how do we make better sense of this data? How do we make smarter decisions from this data? And I think that's where Azure services really come in. So when we think about moving our applications into Azure and re-architecting our applications, we need to think about the data tier as well. A lot of customers start with thinking about their structured data as an example. We know a lot of customers out there use SQL Server, on-premises databases, and Azure offers a great migration path for SQL databases. And the advantages we get are pretty quick return. We get performance advantages as soon as we move those databases into Azure. We get security and compliance benefits, and we also get cost advantages as well because we only pay for what we consume. And some of these deployment models in Azure to help us modernize our data can really help us optimize cost because we can adopt serverless models where we only pay per transaction, and we can also adopt PaaS services which help us lower complexity and lower the management overhead as well. So overall, a very compelling opportunity to move our data into Azure.
Okay, so what's typically involved in data modernization? How does an organization typically go about that journey? What are the first steps?
I think first of all there's a discovery, understanding what data we have and where, what structured data do we have, so relational databases, also unstructured data or even semi-structured data. Azure offers a modernization path for all these different types of data. So I would say the first place to start is a discovery and understanding how our data is currently stored, how our data is currently used and who's accessing it. And then, of course, we need to look at Azure for the different deployment options we have. So if we take out the example around SQL, for example, we have a very simple path, which is to lift and shift those databases into Azure SQL virtual machines. That's a very easy path to achieve because fundamentally it brings the same investments in the skills we've made on premises to the same experience in the cloud. But we also gain instant advantages of improved security, optimized cost, and scalable performance, back to your point about the agility of the cloud as well. But then we've also got options around unstructured data. So within an Azure storage account, which we can think of as a container for different types of storage, we have Azure Blob Storage, which is great for storing documents, media files, music files at unparalleled scale. We also have Azure Files, which is a cloud file share within Azure, which not only allows different users to access files on their own terms and protect them with strong security, it can also help with the app modernization journey, because as we move our applications into the cloud that perhaps rely on an SMB file share, we can use Azure Files to underpin the data for that application. So again, the data tier and the app tier going hand in hand into Azure at the same time. And then, of course, we have Cosmos DB, which is a globally distributed document database, massive scale, very, very high enterprise-grade SLAs, which is perfect for applications that need to be globally distributed, placing data close to the users across the world, and it's capable of indexing whilst the data is being ingested. So, the best thing I think about Cosmos DB is the compatibility with legacy applications. So it may be that on-premise you're running Mongo or Cassandra databases, but through Cosmos DB we have APIs that provide seamless compatibility to those applications through these open APIs. There's one more other important point to talk about, and that's the various different deployment options that we have in Azure to help us move these SQL workloads into the cloud. So just really starting again with the Azure virtual machines. We can lift and shift as is. We can run those, and we get the benefits of much more secure environments. But we're still running infrastructure. We're still responsible for managing the virtual machine and the complexity associated with that. So really, the advantage of moving away from IaaS gives us better benefits with performance. It gives us lower management complexity if we adopt PaaS. So platform as a service is essentially allowing Microsoft to look after the back end for us, and we're simply subscribing to the database service. And there's a number of different deployment options available to us depending on the type of application that we run. So we can have a straightforward Azure SQL database, which we simply subscribe to, single database, or something called Elastic Pool, which is grouping databases together that makes the best use of resources given usage of applications. We've also got SQL Managed Instance, which is a fully programmable SQL Server instance in the cloud. So it gives us more control, but it's still a managed service by Microsoft. And that's actually best for migrating applications at scale and provides near 100% parity, feature parity, with our on-premise SQL environment. So again, very important part of the app and data modernization journey. It really helps to facilitate that. But one thing I did want to mention is that even if we move sort of self-installed SQL virtual machines into Azure, we can also leverage something called the SQL IaaS extension, which is essentially an opportunity for us to still use virtual machines, but actually to have the auto management, the auto patching, the auto backup included as though it was a PaaS service. And we also get visibility of that Azure SQL environments within our SQL blade within the portal. So all of our SQL databases, that's PaaS or IaaS, actually appear on the same management blade. So if you like, it's a nice halfway house. If we have to stay on IaaS for any reason, maybe we don't have the time to go to PaaS in the timescale, we can still use the IaaS extension to improve the management ability of those virtual machines in the cloud. But I guess just to really recap, for me, it's about the quick wins you can get by just moving your SQL databases into Azure or your Cosmos databases, is the instant security benefits that we get, the improved performance and the scalability of those data repositories. We can scale them up or down based on our needs and select different tiers to suit the application. So we've got the agility, the complete flexibility and optimized cost depending on how well used our application is.
Okay, so that's a little bit about the how, but can we talk about the why? So what do organisations look for? What are the benefits they're trying to get out of moving their data to Azure?
Exactly. I mean, that's a great question. I mean, why are we having all this infrastructure? Why are we moving applications? At the end of the day, it comes down to the value of our data. That's, after our people, the most important thing. So as we are moving our content into Azure, we really want to unlock the true insights into that data. And that's where Azure Data Services really comes into its own. So perhaps giving you a use case, really, there are, if you like, 3 sort of high-level stages to getting better value from our data. There's the ingestion of the data into Azure itself, and that could be ingesting from a number of different sources, maybe on-premise sources, databases that are already in the cloud, or even sensors, streaming sensors and bringing that into the Azure ecosystem as well. But once we've got our data into Azure and we've stored that data, we might want to perform some transformation on that data, some modifications to the data to make it behave in a more consistent format. So we might be bringing all these data sources together into a data warehouse where we can then perform analytics on that data. And this is where features in Azure Synapse and Databricks really come into their own. We can apply machine learning to this data to create new data that can help us unlock insights into what that data is actually telling us. So it might be that, for example, a supermarket wants to understand how to better raise the volumes of a particular stock during seasonal activity. So maybe weather data might be giving cause to the right decisions on when to increase stocks of a certain product line. It might be that in a stock market where we're trying to track certain highs and certain lows with a particular stock, we need that visibility of the historical analysis, but also the prescriptive analysis of what might happen based on that historical data in the future. So Azure Synapse and the analytics piece helps us to create prescriptive and predictive analytics on the data that we already have. And in this post-COVID and post-Brexit world, organisations really need to leverage the data in better ways to be smarter and more efficient and effective businesses, to connect with customers in new ways and to really be ahead of the curve. And I think that's what excites me about Azure Data Service, is the fact that all this potential with our data is unlocked through these services.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, Nick? Because when you think about it, practically every company on the planet has a lot of data. And I think that whether they know it or not, they are data companies, and they're probably just constrained in not knowing how to make the most of it or what they can do, what is possible. Have you got any things that come to mind about this problem space, what's possible now, what companies should be thinking about?
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost frustrating, isn't it? I mean, I think we see a very common story across a lot of our different customers. They all have lots and lots of data being used in different ways, in different data stores, commonly held in spreadsheets, in Excel spreadsheets. It's the kind of the easy place that people can manage their own data. But it's not the answer, because we've got this wonderful data that goes back years that has a lot of intelligence there just to be unlocked. And I think the key to it really is understanding just how powerful Azure can be in helping us unlock what this data is telling us. So I would say, my advice would be to start with designing the right information architecture. So understanding what that data is, where it is, and how we can bring it into Azure in the right way so that it can be stored in the right way, it can be transformed, and then it can be analysed and presented out to the right stakeholders through products like Power BI, which can give us the deep visualizations of what the data is telling us. But the information architecture, I always say, leads to AI. It's the path to AI, because you can't attempt to do things like machine learning on data that's not consistent. So we have to bring our data in. We have to do some transformations on that data into our data warehouse. Once it's in our data warehouse and it's consistent, then we can do the deep learning, the deep analytics, and start to provide some great visualizations about what the future holds for that data. So we're moving away from historic descriptive reporting into prescriptive and predictive reporting. And that power in a business, I think, is going to be the cornerstone of the people who are going to get ahead of their competitors. We have to find ways to be smarter. We have to find ways to be more efficient as businesses and give our stakeholders the data they need to be the best version of themselves.
Right, so that's great to think about, what's possible with data these days and what that journey looks like. And I suppose that that's possible in a couple of cloud providers, but something that I often hear about is benefits that are unique to Azure. Can you talk about those and how an organisation can take advantage of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a really important point, that. So, we know that Azure is by far the cheapest hyperscale for Windows and SQL workloads. And the reason I'm pretty confident in that is because I've seen this journey be taken by a number of our customers now, and some of the discounts off the pay-as-you-go pricing that can be achieved. And usually there's a couple of things that help with that. One is something known as the Azure Hybrid Usage Benefit, or AHUB for short. And that essentially allows us to reuse our on-premises licensing investments with software assurance in the cloud and actually only pay for the base compute cost. So essentially it takes away the licensing cost that's built into the pay-as-you-go cost in the cloud. So that immediately gives us significant discounts. But when you couple with that with reserved instances, which is, if you like, committing up front for a certain level of compute for a year or 3 years, those two together can bring discounts of around about 80% over the pay-as-you-go price. So it makes it incredibly cost-effective to bring the SQL workloads and other data workloads into Azure as the long-term home for those data repositories.
So I suppose what that means, Nick, is moving to the cloud, whether it's data or applications, is easier than ever. It seems that the platform is more capable than ever, and yet we know that Microsoft are continuing to advance Azure. So it never stops, really, does it?
Exactly, yeah. I think Microsoft have made it easier than ever now to migrate your data using different tool sets that are provided free of charge to us. We can get quick wins in terms of cost, performance, security, and just availability by just moving into IaaS. But actually the long-term opportunity is actually getting better value from our data through Azure services. So it's a really exciting time, and I can't wait to see what's next.
Moving to the cloud, understanding and securing your infrastructure, data and applications is key. In the next session, Peter Wilson and Pravish Kara will help you understand the security and governance available to you in Azure.
So this session is to cover security and governance in an Azure world. But as part of that, we need to understand from a user perspective how the user is actually going to interact with the systems that we've got in Azure, because obviously from a security and governance point of view, if the user can't use it, well, it's pretty useless.
So let's just start off by debunking a couple of myths around cloud security. So, I get faced with arguments from customers all the time, like, well, surely I'm less secure in the cloud than I am on-premise. On-premise, I can see my data. It sits on servers. I can touch it. It's on my network. It's in my building. I can see the locks to my building. I can tell who's coming in and out. I can control that. Move that into a cloud environment. All of that is all of a sudden abstracted. It's not my kit. I'm sharing it with other people. I don't even know who these other people are. How do you address that?
So yeah, great question. And obviously, if we consider security of our data, the only way really to make our data 100% secure is really to disconnect it, turn it off, and potentially put it in a cave in Scotland somewhere. But from a usability point of view, that's pretty limiting. So it's a bit of a useless argument. But I think if we would consider the argument that yes, your data is more secure on premise, a couple of years ago, I'd have probably agreed with you in that we worked from an office location, we had one connection between us and the outside world, and we'd put a strong firewall across that, and yes, we could make our data nice and secure. But if we look at where we are today, for the last 18 months, we've all been hybrid. We've worked from whatever location is available to us. So no longer are we sat behind that firewall. We're actually sat potentially all over the world accessing that data. So, having it in an office, does that make it secure? Well, if your users aren't there, then possibly not. But let's think about what tools are available to us. So, in the enterprise world, there have been lots of tools available to us for many years, but obviously it's an enterprise cost, where we're able to put lots of different layers around our data, and so not necessarily have to have it behind that office-centric firewall. Well, with the advent of the cloud, we're now able to, as a small business potentially, take advantage of a lot of those enterprise features by just buying it on a per user per month cost. So you're not having to shell out for an enormous enterprise security system. So now, is your data more secure on-premise? Well, I'd temper that and say no. Because of the tooling that's available to you, as I say, for that enterprise level, then no, I think we can put more around that and put it into a cloud-based service and actually make it more secure rather than less.
Right. So just on that subject, then let's debunk another myth. Then, when you move to the cloud, you typically tend to move to a single vendor. Now that obviously introduces risk because everything's in one place, with one vendor. How do you address that risk?
So yeah, from a Microsoft-centric point of view, we as an organisation are very Microsoft-centric. And yes, we use a lot of Microsoft tooling to provide the security wrappers and the governance wrappers around our systems that we place in Azure. That said, at times we do use third-party tooling in key areas of the system designs if a client has a specific requirement or if a potential Microsoft product actually is not necessarily as mature as we would want it to be in a particular space. Now, there are advantages to using the Microsoft tooling because obviously they're all sharing intelligence with each other. So whether that be, across the on-premise world, across even the gaming world, and across obviously the cloud world. So all of that intelligence is coming together into the tooling that Microsoft are using. So, there's lots of great intelligence to help you be more secure. But for example, if we look at, say, a firewall in an Azure world, quite often we're using third-party products. So whether it be Fortinet, Cisco, etc., to build out a third-party firewalling to provide, firewalling into the environment, intrusion prevention services, potentially VPN to end devices, with those third-party tools, just to add that extra piece and that extra third party to meet some of those requirements where clients aren't happy having all of their eggs in one basket.
Right. Azure plays nicely with third-party tooling as well. It's not, you don't just have to take Microsoft security technologies, you can actually plug other things in.
Absolutely you can. And obviously if we take that the other way and think about multi-clouds, so think about some of the other clouds out there, the AWSs and the GCPs, the Microsoft cloud technologies will actually work across those clouds as well. So we can do it both ways, if that makes sense.
It does. So
from a security world, obviously I've talked there about how we can use the Microsoft tooling. Let's think about how, what's important from a security and governance point of view. In your view, what are the key pieces we need to think about?
So from my side of things, there's like three main areas, and top of the list is compliance. It's obviously a really big area. There are more compliance requirements coming upon organizations these days. A lot of them are focused on security. What do you do with these? It's not just one compliance requirement. Sometimes you get 2 or 3, and they have overlap between them. How do you manage that situation? And I think the technology choices you make is either going to help you or hinder you in meeting those compliance requirements. Thankfully, Azure has compliance built into the capability that it offers, not just to show you where you might be compliant and where you might not be compliant, but it also has the ability to enforce that as well. So that's a very big area and can really help in the compliance challenge and the compliance landscape that people have or businesses have. Then the second point is around threat management. The threat landscape is broadening and deepening. If you read the latest threat intelligence, you can see that they're adapting and evolving in terms of how they're working and approaching how the attack methods and techniques that they use. If the recent intelligence that I read showed that they've adapted their commercial model now. So threats are actually offering their infrastructure and their know-how as a service. So you can literally buy their service and just use it in whichever attack that you wanted.
Yeah.
It's gone beyond that now. They're almost in a franchise model where different threat actors are actually getting together now, tag teaming, because they specialize in different areas. You've got one threat who's really good at breaking and entering and having persistence in an organization's network or systems. And then once they've got that persistence, they then tag team with malware delivery specialists who then deliver malware like ransomware. And together they take a cut of whatever profit comes off the back of it.
And I believe you can buy a support contract for that as well if you need to.
That's right, yeah. It's exactly like a business model, but you don't pay any tax, obviously.
Yeah, well, indeed, yes.
And then the third area that really needs focus is attack surface, because when you're in the cloud or any environment really, you have an attack surface, and minimizing that obviously is a key aim. And one thing to remember about the cloud is that whilst the cloud provider controls one part of it, there's definitely a responsibility on you as a business to control the other part of it. the responsibility is definitely shared. So staying on top of that attack landscape, particularly because there are so many more vulnerabilities coming out, you just need to be aware of what that looks like. And it's not just from a technology perspective that you need to be concerned about. Sometimes configuration errors are brought in through human error as well. So for example, people put stuff on cloud file storage and they don't put any permissions or lock it down, and threat actors are finding this information. And similarly, developers, when they develop code and they have API keys in there and they're pushing that to public code repositories, again, you've got another leak of information there. Inadvertently, all accidental, but it puts it out there, available to anybody who might want to leverage it against you. And then another big area in terms of vulnerabilities is around identities and around password usage as well. So we all know, there's like 1 billion actual real passwords that are available to anybody that knows where to look on the internet. So these aren't just made up words. These are passwords that people have actually used, which is a major issue in itself. So you can't just rely on passwords. So just focusing on the identity side of things, what views do you have on identity-based risks and how to tackle them?
So from an identity point of view, I guess really, in terms of security, we've got this imponderable link between users using the system and obviously making it as secure as we can. And identity is really where that interface happens. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that the users using the system, first of all, are who they say they are, but also we then need to try and make it as easy as we can for the users to gain access to the system, but then make it secure. So what we want to try and do with the new systems is really make that interface as easy as it can be. If we look at how organizations have done this in the past, it can be quite difficult where you need your key fob to be able to gain access, you need to spin up a VPN to gain access into systems, and from a user perspective it can get really difficult and really hard. So a lot of the systems we're doing today are actually a lot simpler than that, but have all of that embedded security. So for example, some systems that we use today, we'll just look at the laptop. And looking at the laptop actually will use our facial recognition to log us into the system. That's a really good biometric way of logging in. And just as an aside, it's really clever. It doesn't work with masks. So obviously we've been testing that recently with everybody having to wear a mask. So in a public area it doesn't work. But I have seen it, and I've heard a story where one of my colleagues has got twins, and it was actually able to understand the difference between the twins and log them in specifically. So it is really clever software. That's the Windows Hello piece. But what we're doing with that is that's giving us, if you like, the MFA access into the system. And if we're from a low risk location or low risk environment, then that will normally just let us in. What it will do though is if it sees, let's say, you're trying to log in from multiple geographies at the same time, or you're trying to log in from a machine that isn't part of your corporate environment, for example, it will enforce another MFA, so another token, something like that. And that's normally an application on your phone to make you log in. But what we're trying to do is base that on a risk profile, so that if there's not a high risk that you aren't who you say you are, then it's not going to prompt you for that type of access. So just making it simple for the users. The final part to that is then linking a lot of the third-party applications that we all use that aren't necessarily a Microsoft tool, link them to the Microsoft identity. So you're using what's called single sign-on. So you're not having to remember all of those passwords that you've got out there. So it's all seamlessly integrated with that single ID. So you are logging in securely with risk-based focus onto that identity, which is then used seamlessly across the rest of your applications. That is the de facto really way of doing it, to try and make it as secure and as easy as we can do for the users.
So actually that reminds me, the taking of different signals about how a user authenticates and using that in a risk-based manner to decide whether to allow a user in or not. And that reminds me of some recent, there's a big increase in marketing right now around a terminology called zero trust. Mm-hmm. So, boil that down, Pete. What is that?
Okay, zero trust. As the name suggests, it's all about really not trusting anything both in terms of the devices that you're using, but also the identity that the person that's trying to log on. So, you know, back in the day, you know, we talked about this earlier, that within your enterprise location, if you were logging in from a particular building behind a corporate firewall, really that should be a trusted environment, so you should be able to log in. Zero trust is about actually, we don't trust that anymore, because, you know, threat actors could be sat within your environment potentially. You know, they may have hacked onto your Wi-Fi, for example, so they could still be coming from that corporate environment. So zero trust is about making sure that you are authenticating everything, not trusting any location or device, and making sure your data is encrypted and protected all the way through. So it's all about really thinking that no location is a trusted location and putting all the controls in there to make sure you are who you say you are. So for example, you know, we're doing a lot of work at the moment with organizations and making sure their Wi-Fi and their switching environments are as secure as they can be. So we're using 802.1x type technologies and making sure that we are securing those environments. But back in the day, you know, we're talking about cloud products here, we would have always used a Microsoft PKI-based environment that's based on our on-premise equipment. Now we're using SaaS-based controls. So again, we're bringing that technology down from the enterprise and into the SMB market to make sure that everybody's network is secured as much as it can be.
And do you have any examples of where, you know, identity and zero trust has been leveraged for some of our clients?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, take some examples. You know, we're working with an organisation on a national infrastructure project. Now, as you can imagine, that has got a very high profile organisation. It is, you know, potentially prone to lots of threat actors out there who may actually look to try and hack into the systems. So yes, we're using the full estate of products that we've talked about here. So whether it be, as I say, the Windows Hello login, with the single sign-on into third-party applications, with the login to the Wi-Fi, secure login to the Wi-Fi and the switching, with all of those controls around the environment to make sure that the access to the identity and therefore on to the other third-party pieces is as secure as it can be.
And they don't need to remember their passwords.
And they don't need to remember their passwords, and it works really, really well. It's, you know, it's really great from a user experience point of view.
It's brilliant.
Do you have any examples where we might have part done this, or users haven't set up their identity protection properly?
Yeah, so there's probably a couple of good examples. So we had a financial services client and we did a deployment of a remote desktop service into Azure. But as part of their deployment, we also inherited their identities that they already had configured. Unfortunately, one of them had a very bad password, a well-known password from a password breach. And that was leveraged by a threat actor who then gained access. Luckily for this client, you know, we spotted it, and because we were in the middle of the build and migration, there wasn't any impact to the client themselves because there wasn't anything sensitive on the system. And our response was to just squash the server and start it again. So that solved the problem for them, but that was a lucky escape. The other thing that I see is where MFA actually has been deployed and configured and implemented, but because there isn't an understanding of some of the cloud services that are available, often things like legacy services, for example, in Exchange Online, you get legacy services like POP3 and IMAP. Those protocols don't use modern authentication, which means they're not going to leverage MFA. And if you enable MFA on one interface but not on another, threat actors are going to find that other interface and make their way in, and they have done, and that's their initial foothold into your environment to start understanding how you work as an organization. They've got access to treasure troves of emails to look through, work out how payments are made, and start interjecting themselves into those conversations to manipulate people into sending money where they shouldn't, for example.
Yeah, I'll say it's an interesting world out there.
Yeah, that's right. So, identity and MFA is just one area or one specific bit of technology in the Azure stack, or even in the cloud world. Just broadening that out. What else is available to businesses to leverage from a security perspective in Azure?
So if we think about the broader estate of technologies, and we talk specifically more about Azure, because obviously we've talked about how the users will access the resources in Azure. We're designing Azure systems using lots of different types of technology within the Microsoft estate. So some of them will be very familiar to organizations, and specifically from a networking standpoint. So we're using landing zone approaches to design our Azure environments. So we're segmenting the environment up in Azure using firewalling technologies between the different segments, as you would with any on-premise type system. So even though it's based in the cloud, we're still splitting it out into those smaller segments so that we can isolate workload environments, for instance, from each other to make it as secure as we can. So if, for instance, you have an attack in one, we can limit that attack and make sure that it doesn't flow into a different workload within the same platform. So yes, we're using all of those standard type approaches. But not only that, we're then using some of the other Azure tooling, and there is lots of other tooling that is obviously available within the Microsoft estate. Now, if I was to pick a couple of these, we could talk for the next hour or so about all of the different pieces that are available to us. But let's talk about Azure Security Center, for example. So again, that comes with a number of different elements actually just within that one set of tooling. Whether that be things like the Azure Defender, so we can put obviously an antivirus or an anti-malware, or it's an antivirus, anti-malware on steroids really, where it's able to obviously understand what's going on the machine, both from an applications that are running on it, but also then to understand, if a threat actor gains on there, what elements it's actually interacting with on that machine, but then actually work not only on the operating system, but across different workloads. So SQL, for example, it can plug directly into those types of applications. And one of the key parts with that is actually then feeding that intelligence or those alerts back into the overall Microsoft ecosystem so that we can alert, we can monitor, and then we can react on those types of technologies. So that's just one element of the tooling we have available to us. Now, obviously, I know that Sentinel, which is obviously the overarching piece that we're talking about there, where all of these alerts go into, is a favourite tool of yours, Prav. So do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, Sentinel is a favourite subject of mine. I mean, you said you could talk for an hour on other subjects, but I could probably talk for a day on Sentinel. Sentinel is obviously the Microsoft's cloud native SIEM solution, so that's security, incident and event management. In a nutshell, it just brings together all of your security events from all of your different data sources that you have out there, your laptops, your desktops, your servers, your cloud workloads, your SaaS applications. It doesn't matter what it is, it just brings it all together in one place so you can actually see all of that data. Now, obviously, you're going to have a lot of data to look at, and it's not very useful in that raw format, and the power of Sentinel comes into it when it actually correlates the activity that's going on and pieces it all together. Mm-hmm. And what that really does is that it then surfaces up high fidelity alerts when it detects an actual threat on your network. It means there's less alerts for people to be looking at. Traditional SIEMs tend to have almost a one-to-one correlation with a log event and an actual alert off the back of that log, whereas Sentinel changes the dynamic slightly and only surfaces high fidelity alerts mm-hmm. that actually it can correlate across multiple data sources. So mm-hmm. there's an immediate advantage there. And then it's not only does it handle high fidelity alerts as well, but it also adds in orchestration and mm-hmm. automation on top of that as well. So mm-hmm. that's really important because the aim of the game here is that if a threat is on your infrastructure, on your IT systems, accessing your data, you want to minimize their dwell time as mm-hmm. much as possible. Now, obviously, if there's a human responding to threat behavior, it's going to take a lot longer than, say, a Sentinel would or a compute-based way of doing it. Mm-hmm. So the automation and orchestration piece actually understands this threat behavior there and takes automatic action to mm-hmm. contain that threat and chuck them out of the environment, which mm-hmm. is absolutely brilliant. It helps mm-hmm. reduce the impact of mm-hmm. any potential incursion that you might have on your systems.
Mm-hmm. And as we talked about earlier, if you think about the small medium business where in the past having these SIEM type technology with all of this automation would have been way outside the scope of the budget of this type of organisation. It's available.
That's right, and it's not difficult to implement either. You don't need to be a developer to do these things. It's almost plug and play like Lego bricks when you're putting together a logic app that would, in effect, be your playbook that creates that automation to respond to any kind of threat behavior. Like, for example, if you wanted to lock an account out, that could be automated. If you wanted to disable a network port on your server VM, that could be automated. If you wanted to block a firewall port, that could be automated. It doesn't just have to be Azure technology. If your other third-party security technology also supports that remote accessibility, it could take the same actions there as well. Again, main aim being reduce dwell time, reduce impact. The other area that's really good in Sentinel is that because it's gathering all of this data and normalizing it, you've got rich intelligence there to pull on in terms of creating visualizations and doing analysis. It's a data scientist's dream working in that environment, and it's really good for SOC analysts to look at that data, create visualizations, because it helps them spot patterns that the threat detection aspects of Sentinel may not have spotted. And it also allows you to trend that data over time as well. And that really helps because it helps build models that you can then adapt and create detections from. Yeah. And all that data really gives SOC analysts the ability to be more proactive. Threat hunting is something where an analyst will look at that data and attempt to detect threat behavior before it's actually triggered an alert. So it's trying to find out whether a threat is in your environment or trying to get into your environment, and that way you've reduced the dwell time even further.
Very cool.
So security isn't just the only risk that needs addressing here. Security is about confidentiality, it's about integrity, but there's a core function of that tenet called availability. So can you walk us through what aspects in Azure are available to help on the availability side of things?
Sure, yeah, no problems. It's a cloud-based service, so cloud-based services, as you would expect, have availability built in, and they're part of any design. That said, obviously we need to make sure that we're designing systems to take advantage of all of that availability. So within Azure, we can talk about availability sets, availability zones, where we're having, a workload. Let's take Active Directory, for example, in an IaaS world, where we may have multiple Active Directory servers, and we set those in an availability set so that they're on different pieces of hardware within that Microsoft cloud, and Microsoft will guarantee that neither one of those two will go down at the same time. So we've got that capability. But also we can go to different regions. So let's say we've got our availability set in UK South. We can mirror that to UK West. So we can have an AD server sitting there as well. So let's say the worst happened and UK South went offline. We can then obviously scale that up within UK West as well. So we can have all of that availability across those different regions, but also within region. Now that's an IaaS service. There are other technologies available to us for a standard IaaS type server where we can replicate those between regions as well using things like Azure Site Recovery. So we've got all of that tooling available to us. And I think one of the key differences really between a cloud-based service like Azure and back to our on-premise days is that what we used to do is we'd put one compliance, one availability, one sort of backup type technology around our whole estate. We don't really need to do that anymore because the tooling is easily configured, easily there for us to scale out, scale down, whatever it might be. We can actually put an availability or a configuration on each workload rather than the whole workload. So that's what we spend a lot of time doing, is making sure that we are configuring each workload's availability and governance specifically for that workload. So if, for instance, it's a SQL type workload where we need that to be highly available, we'll scale that across 2 regions, for example. If it's a file server that's really just there for historic data purposes, then potentially we would just leave that in a single region, maybe just have a backup of that into a second region, and we'd scale that up if we need to. And obviously the costs, we can manage the costs across that very quickly and very easily within an Azure world. So it gives us all of those flexible options that you don't really have if you're doing an on-premise type system. Now that's IaaS, so infrastructure as a service. If we think about platform as a service, or PaaS, then it's, again, we've got a lot more capability. So in that type of model, Microsoft are managing the underlying operating system for us. So all we're doing is really gaining access to the application that's sitting on top of it. So SQL, for example.
Yep.
And within that SQL world, it's very easy and very quick to configure that, to replicate that to a second region, for example, to give us that availability. And we don't need to worry about all of the pieces under the hood. So, that's what Microsoft do. That's part of the service. So it's really configurable and really granular as to what we can do for our availability configurations. Now, one of those things that we really have to consider when we're doing that availability is actually the networking that plugs all this together so that users continue to access to it. Now, again, I could talk at length about the networking side of things, not really for this session because I think we're just about out of time. So we'll park that for the next session.
Brilliant. Thanks, Pete.
Coming up, Paul Collins of Content and Cloud and Noelia Martinez of Microsoft discuss the environmental and sustainability opportunity and impact of moving to Azure.
Thanks for making the time to come and see us today. Really appreciate that. Could you tell us a little bit about your background and what sustainability means to you personally?
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here in Manchester talking about cloud computing and sustainability. So my background is astrophysics. I did a PhD in astrophysics and work in simulations of galaxy formation for a long time. So computers all around and clusters. And then turned into data scientist. And I've been doing that in London for a long time before being the head of data science of the company and then jumping into Microsoft. And on the sustainability bit, in particular, I have a great passion about it because I relate to it in a very personal way. I'm from Argentina, so I've seen deforestation firsthand in the region where I was born, and I got all the time the sense of urgency that we are through an historical moment and we need to be moving fast to make things right.
Let's start off by exploring Microsoft's commitment to sustainability. I know Microsoft believe that technology can help solve some of the world's biggest challenges. So what's Microsoft's stance on sustainability?
Yes, at Microsoft we believe that the science is clear and we need to stop emissions before we reach 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So here in the city where the Industrial Revolution started, it makes sense to talk about this. Cloud computing gives you a huge opportunity to build solutions and to empower partners to bring these different solutions through technology and alive into Azure and in different cloud products. But Microsoft has identified 4 pillars on sustainability and we made very strong commitments. So the first one, for example, it's carbon negative, to be carbon negative by 2030, and then to reduce the historical emissions by 2050. And there is a pledge of $1 billion for the Climate Fund, which will bring this money to build new technologies around carbon capture as well. Then very ambitious pledges around waste and water. So it's water positive by 2030 and zero waste by 2030. But the most interesting, for me at least, my soft spot, is the planetary computer, which I think is a unique proposition. So the planetary computer, it's a hub where different data sets will be integrated to provide for the very unique vision of what the planet really looks like. If you could understand how ecosystems interact, because we don't really know what makes an ecosystem thrive, how many species are there, how they are connected, but we do interact with them without this knowledge. And we're not doing really well this. Actually, we're going through what the scientists call the 6th extinction. There have been 5 of them before, the dinosaurs maybe rings a bell, and this is very bad news really, because an extinction it's a domino effect. So if one species disappears, the others tend to disappear as well. And our whole planetary boundaries, the whole life system that we know depends on a huge amount of things we don't know how they interact, and the species are disappearing very, very fast. So one little example on how dependent we are on this, probably you've heard before, if bees disappear, our whole pollination system disappears as well, and it's super expensive to replace. So life as we know it is threatened, and I think the planetary computer can bring this knowledge together and can bring the science, the open data to be able to provide this information and interact and react proactively with the environment.
So outside of the impact our actions have on the planet, why do you think it's important for businesses to act on sustainability?
Yeah, this is an amazing question. I think you're right. Each of us has a responsibility on our own individual actions, and we cannot ignore that. But it's also the bigger differences on how the climate change is going to impact different people and different ages. So I think there are 3 differentiators here, but let's start with the business case. I think if businesses don't adopt sustainability quickly, they will be left behind, because there is, the ethical considerations, regulations come in, but there is also a demand that we see in young people, young consumers. There is this feeling that this is the right thing to do, and we should be running in the opposite direction of what we've been doing so far. In terms of why we need to cooperate with businesses, well, this is such a big problem to cut the emissions quickly enough. And if you think about it, the benefits of the industrialization are not evenly distributed around the world, and the ones who benefited the most also contributed the most historically, so they bear the greatest responsibility in acting fast. Then also the least responsible are the ones that are going to be hit hardest, like the youth, the global south. So again, businesses in the global north bear, I think, the ethical responsibility of doing this at the right time, which is right now. And the third consideration is that not everyone has the capability to structure and strategize solutions as we can do here. So that benefit and that privilege, I think, has to be used in the right way. We believe in Microsoft that we can do this faster than anyone, so we should do this. It's going to be hard, but we need to collaborate. And the biggest thing we can do is empower exactly this, businesses, customers, or partners, to do more on sustainability. We have the practices, we thought about it, we have the technology, the clean cloud, so we are the place to come to build these solutions and help solve this big challenge for the humankind.
So throughout our event today, we've been hearing how customers can transform their business through the adoption of Microsoft cloud technologies. Could you tell us a little bit about how adopting the cloud can help their sustainability credentials as well?
Yes, sure. So at Microsoft, it's important to guarantee that the cloud is as clean and green as possible. So a lot of thought and engineering has been put into that. And we have what is called the Sustainability Calculator, which is a really nice app that you can see through Power BI, and it shows you in a dashboard what your emissions look like in the cloud. And the way to be sure that the cloud is doing a good work and is efficient, it's by checking, for example, what's the comparison of what it will be to run your cloud services or your cloud products on-premise and what it is actually to run it on Microsoft, and the difference of the emissions. The difference between cloud computing on-premise and cloud computing on the public cloud, Microsoft Cloud, is that many processes are very efficient. So we have the IT operational efficiency, the IT equipment efficiency, the data center infrastructure efficiency, and finally, it's all about renewable electricity feeding the cloud. In particular, the IT operational efficiency has these systems of dynamic provisioning. This means like no servers are left just running with no demand, and we can use artificial intelligence to actually understand the peak of the patterns and predict and be very, very, very good at optimizing the servers. And the other thing is multi-tenancy. So different servers, different functions are used by different customers and partners, and that makes the cloud super efficient. So you can see in the sustainability calculator that if you move from on-premise to the cloud, you can reduce up to 98% your CO2 emissions.
You mentioned the Microsoft Sustainability Calculator. Would you be able to tell us a little bit more about how that works?
So the sustainability calculator, it's a wonderful app that you can use for your company to see your scope 1 and 3 emissions. And it's plugged directly through an API to your company, and the data comes through, and we see the consumption that you have had in Azure and how much emissions you have from that. And this is super important for reporting of the greenhouse emissions according to the protocols. And as we know, reporting is not only good to have, but at some point will be mandatory.
Microsoft have obviously invested heavily and are doing lots of great work to make sure their solutions are sustainable. Have you got any examples about how customers are leveraging cloud technologies to deliver sustainability solutions?
Yeah, there's a huge array in these 4 pillars we identify on water, waste, energy and carbon, and ecosystems. I can think of a few. I've been working with partners on at least 2 of these projects last week on Hack, and one of them was actually financial services banks and financial institutions need to be very transparent on how their carbon emissions come across the different fundings and the different buckets of investment. So everything around carbon emission reporting, like the sustainability calculator, but more for the whole organization, it's one of the uses of the cloud in these solutions. Another more interesting, probably, if you are into the IoT and connected devices and artificial intelligence that we've seen, is how you can monitor water waste and water usage through putting devices in different places and being able to connect all that through the Azure IoT Hub, and then connect that to Synapse and have analytics and be able to predict the demand, predict and see where the measures need to be taken proactively instead of reactively. And that saves a lot of money and a lot of water to the environment. And another example of what you can do for agriculture, for example, it's been putting, again, IoT sensors all around in different fields to see how the soil is coping with different pesticides. So it's important to collect the data and know, for example, when it's the best moment to harvest the crops. So the example of the harvesting, if you use satellite data, you can see with image recognition when it's the right time for the harvest. And this technology has produced bigger yields that not using the technology. So that's already a better use of the land, is more sustainable. So it's important that we use these resources because it transforms industries, traditional industries like agriculture, and we have to be mindful of the resources we have.
Oh, that's really interesting. Thanks for sharing that. It seems like there's some industries and sectors that are really pushing it ahead, but there is danger that some industries may get left behind?
I think so, yes. There is a risk, of course, that people won't be up to the challenge. But there is also huge benefits of moving in this direction. And I think the Rebuild Green that the government has been pushing, the European Union pushing as well the green recovery, the new Green Deal from the US, I just see that this is the right path. And Microsoft is here to empower and to help our customers, our partners, in that direction with our practices and with the sustainability solutions that we already built and we can use together.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you for spending your time with us today. We hope that you have found these sessions useful and informative. We know that with a topic as big as Azure, it's not possible to cover everything in the last few hours. So we also have some additional resources to help you on your cloud transformational journey. We have a landing page that collects not just the content that you've seen today, but also further information, technical deep dives, white papers, ebooks, all designed to make it easier for you to make that move to the cloud. We also know that every move to the cloud is unique, and why we've covered some of the most common drivers and some of the most common usages, your move to the cloud will be unique to you and your organization. So as part of that, we'd also like to make an offer that we will help you and your organization through a free Azure Discovery Workshop. This is available to the first 10 customers to register their details via that landing page, and one of our team will then be in touch to help you personalize and develop your personal cloud plan for making that transformation move. And lastly, we also know that Azure is a constantly evolving, innovative product set. So as part of that, you can also subscribe to the Content and Cloud channel, which will allow you to keep up to date with the latest innovations in Azure. Thank you again for your time today, and myself and the team look forward to speaking to you again soon. Many thanks.